Hello, FrontendConf. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for being here. My name is Manuel Matuzovic. I'm a front-end developer from Vienna. I'm also a freelancer, and I'm specialized in HTML, CSS, and accessibility. If you are interested in these topics, you can find me on Twitter as mmatuzo. I like to write there about that. Also, the slides for this talk are already online, so if you want to follow along on your laptop, it's online at bit.ly/dark-grid-fc. Today, I'm here to talk about CSS Grid Layout. I want to show you how awesome Grid is, but I especially want to talk about the dark side of the Grid. So about some bad things you can do with Grid. Before I do that, let me introduce Grid to you. CSS Grid Layout is a grid-based layout system built for two-dimensional layouts. So it's perfect if you're not just working on one axis, but on both axes. It's actually the first true layout method in CSS. Before that, we had, and of course still have, float and display inline block, display table cell, position if you really want to, flexbox of course, but none of these was built for building multi-dimensional layouts. Some of you might have had the pleasure of building layouts using HTML tables. Who built layouts using tables? Okay, a few older people here, that's cool. And the fun thing about Grid is that it is kind of like building table-based layouts, except it's responsive and flexible. And this is the big difference, it's described in CSS and not in HTML. The people behind CSS wanted to implement grids very early on. They were very much inspired by what people or designers were doing in print magazines and books, so they wanted to get Grid in to the browser. And in the early 90s, there were first ideas, but it was just too complex to implement. Then in the mid-90s, they had a draft for a thing called frame-based layout module, but it never found its way into a browser. And the same happened for the advanced layout module, which was later renamed to template layout module. It was introduced in 2005, but it also didn't make its way into a browser. Fast forward a few years, Microsoft was working on Windows 8 and the Metro design you all love. And they wanted to enable developers to build apps using web technologies, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And for that, they needed a very flexible layout system. And Flexbox is flexible, of course, it's in the name. But Flexbox loses its flexibility as soon as you start using FlexWrap and adding widths to your Flex items. So they needed something better. They had to come up with something. And they did. They invented Grid in 2011. And they shipped it behind the MS vendor prefix in IE10. So Microsoft was the company who invented Grid. And then in 2012, they presented the first draft to the W3C, and the W3C actually liked what they saw. So the CSS working group began tweaking Microsoft's proposal, and they took some ideas from the advanced layout module and the frame-based model, and they came up with a draft, an official draft. But before a draft can become an official implementation, recommendation, there have to be at least two separate independent implementations in browsers. But most browsers were kind of gun shy. They were afraid of implementing Grid because they had some bad experience with another specification, with CSS regions. Who of you knows of CSS regions? Okay, not a single person, or was it one hand? So, okay, it never found its way into a browser because there were problems. However, all of a sudden, Bloomberg, the media company, came along and they hired Igalia, which is an open source consultancy, and they wanted them to implement grids in Blink and WebKit. So they really, really wanted grids for some reason. And the rest is history. And then last year in January, Chromium 56 was the first browser to ship Grid, and then in early March we had Chrome and Firefox, and by the end of March Opera and Safari, and finally on October 17th Edge. So all major browsers shipped Grid within a year, which is amazing because the specification is really, really extensive. There are a lot of new properties, there are new values to existing properties, and there are even new related specifications and updated specifications like the box alignment module and the CSS intrinsic and extrinsic sizing module. What a name. So there is a lot about Grid, and I can't talk about everything, but if you have any questions about Grid, please find me at the Meet the Speakers area or in the evening and ask me anything you want. All right, now before I get to the core part of my presentation, I shortly have to address the name of this talk and the design of my slides. It's of course based on the album The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, which was released in 1973. I am a huge Pink Floyd fan. I know everything about them. Nah, I'm just kidding. I don't know anything. I know that they exist. I know that this album exists. I've heard the song Another Brick in the Wall, but that's pretty much it. I'm really sorry. I've learned some new things because this is not the first time that I'm giving this talk. People constantly are sending me songs via Twitter and telling me to listen to them. Some guy even created an Amazon wish list with some LPs for me to listen to and movies to watch because I have this huge lack of knowledge. But I'm pretty sure that in this room, I'm not the only person with this lack of knowledge. That's why I present to you Pink Floyd fun fact number 1. The Dark Side of the Moon is with over 45 million copies sold, the 4th best-selling album worldwide. Number 3 is Back in Black by AC/DC. Number 2 is Their Greatest Hits by the Eagles. And number 1, of course, Thriller by Michael Jackson with 66 million copies sold. And now visual order. This is the first topic I want to talk about today and the most extensive one. In Grid, there are many different ways of changing visual order. There is explicit placement, there is the order property, there is absolute positioning, which we can combine with explicit placement. There's autoflow and areas. All of them are really interesting. And before I go into detail, I want to shortly talk about visual order in general. Both the tab order, so the order in which a keyboard user jumps from one item to another item in a page, follow the tab order and the screen reader order follow DOM order, so they follow the order in HTML. If we change visual order, so if we take CSS and change the order, it has no effect on tab and screen reader order. So if we have a document with a few elements and the visual order matches the DOM order, everything is fine. But as soon as we start changing visual order, we might get a mismatch between DOM order and visual order, and this can be problematic for some people. Let me give you an example. Let's say we have this paragraph with a few links and a form. If I tap through this page, you can see that focus jumps from the first item to the second, to the third, and so on. So it's very easy to follow and very predictable. But if the visual order does not match the DOM order, it's very hard to predict where focus will go next. So it's hard for keyboard users to predict where focus will go next. This is the first issue. Another one is that users of screen magnifiers might be confused if the zoomed in, the enhanced part of the screen skips around a lot. Here's an example. So I'm using here the built-in screen magnifier on macOS. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen is the zoomed-in part of the screen. And I'm now using the tab key to browse this gallery. And what you can see now is that you don't see anything. It's a dark side of the slide, yes. Okay, now you can see it. What you can see now is that the zoomed in area skips around a lot, and it's very hard to follow where you are on that page, so that might confuse users of screen magnifiers. And another reason why it's problematic if visual order doesn't match DOM order is that if a blind user is using a website together with a sighted user who follows visual order, they might be confused if they encounter information in different order. Now, who uses a keyboard for navigation? Well, of course, people with physical disabilities who can't use a mouse, for example, a person with just one arm or no arms. People with chronic conditions, such as repetitive stress injuries, who should avoid the use of mouse. Or just people who temporarily can't use a mouse due to an injury, for example, because they had a broken arm. Or last year in Budapest, I met a girl and she told me that she got a tattoo on her forearm and she wasn't able to use a mouse for 2 weeks because it just hurt too much. So there are also temporary impairments. And also power users, people like you and me, we use the keyboard all the time in VS Code and Sublime and Vim, of course, and I don't know, Photoshop, whatever. So why not use it in the browser as well? And it's pretty much everyone. Sometimes it's just easier or more convenient to use a keyboard. DOM order and visual order and the match or mismatch also affects screen reader users. Who uses a screen reader? Well, blind people, of course, but blind people are not the only people who use a screen reader. So a screen reader is a software that announces text on a page. But also people with low vision who supplement what they see on the screen by announcing it with a screen reader. So they use it in addition to what they see on the screen. And also people with learning disabilities. So that's the general issue with visual order and DOM order. Now let's look at grids. The first thing we can do in grid is we can explicitly place items in our grid. Let's say we have this grid. It's a 3x3 grid with 9 items, and you can see that they are neatly aligned, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. Now, if I tap through this grid, you can see that the focus jumps from the first item to the second to the third, and as soon as it reaches the end of a line, it jumps into the next line. So everything is fine. And now grid gives us the ability to select any item in our grid and place it where we want, in any column or row. Or actually, it's possible to place it on lines, and we can use the grid column properties or the grid row properties for that. Now, if I do that in our example, I just select some of the items and I place them on different areas. This is what we get. You can see that the visual order is now completely different. But if I tap through this grid, you can see that focus still follows DOM order, and it's very hard to predict where focus will go next. Of course, in this example, it's not hard to predict because there are numbers, but usually we don't have numbers in our components and our items on our websites. Another way of changing order is the order property. You might know it from Flexbox. It works pretty much the same way as it works in Flexbox. You select an item, you set the order property to a specific number, and then you have the same effect as with reordering in explicit placement. Another way of changing order is autoflow, and autoflow is really interesting. Let's say we have a grid like this, where not all items have the same size. We can make grid items span multiple columns or multiple rows. Now, if we apply explicit placement on these grids, it might happen that we get gaps due to the different sizes of our grid items. This doesn't look very nice. There's a thing we can do. We can select this grid and use the grid autoflow property and change it to a dense packing mode. So there are 3 values for grid autoflow, row, column, and dense. And if we do that, the grid looks like this. This is really, really, really cool. But what the browser does, or the grid does, is it takes any item it can find and try to fill in those gaps. This is nice, but again, order is now very hard to predict. Another really cool feature in grid are areas. Who of you knows of areas in grid? 1, 2, 3, okay. You are going to like that. Let's say we have to build something like this. We have a header, we have a main content, we have some ads, we have a newsletter sign up, and a footer. On mobile, this would be a single column layout with 5 boxes. Web design, isn't it exciting? So I can describe this layout in CSS if I want to. So I would select the container, in my example here the body, I set display to grid, and then I use the grid template areas property to define areas. And I can define an area by using quotes and any name I want to. So I have now 5 areas, and each area is a row. So I have a header, content, ads, newsletter, and footer, and so on. And now I can place items in those areas. Now, let's say someone from the marketing department comes along and says, you know what, we really have to push the newsletter sign up. We have to promote it. We have to put it up in the design. Now, what I should do is to move it up in HTML, but I don't have to. The only thing I have to do with areas is to just move this line up, and that's it. No position absolute or whatever, no negative margins or any other hack. I just move this line up and everything's fine. Kinda. The problem is, if I now use the keyboard on this design, you can see that the focus will jump from the header to the main content, to the ads, back up to the newsletter, and down to the footer. Of course, here it's not that much of a problem, but usually a page is much longer, so the focus will skip from the top to the bottom and back to the top and so on. Now you might say, who uses a keyboard on mobile? Well, according to the screen reader survey of last year, 15.7% of participants use a keyboard on their mobile device. And this doesn't just apply to mobile devices. You can also use grid template areas for building multi-column layout. So you could use, you could set the breakpoint using media queries and just change the layout. All right, now there are a lot of ways of changing order, and there are a lot of ways of getting it wrong. You might think, or at least I do, isn't this something the browser should fix somehow, or the W3C, or whoever is responsible? I don't know. I'm not going to answer that question, but let's look at our options. So what can we do? Well, we could dynamically change the source order of every breakpoint by using JavaScript, or maybe we shouldn't do that. We could apply tab index and aria flow to every single item in our page. So we can change the tab order using tab index and the way screen readers read content, or the order using aria flow to. The thing is, using tab index values higher than 0 is a very bad practice, and also aria flow to isn't very well supported, so we're not going to do that. We could try browser sniffing and send different HTML to different device types, or maybe not, because I think we've learned that browser sniffing isn't a good thing. We could, of course, mitigate the problem by providing skip links, but we should do that anyway. Who of you does not know what skip links are? Okay, please find me afterwards and I will be happy to show you what skip links are. They're amazing. They help keyboard users a lot and also screen reader users. Or another thing we could do is we could just not change visual order. That's actually what the CSS working group or the W3C suggests. They say authors must use order and the grid placement properties only for visual, not logical reordering of content. Yeah, that's really nice of them, but we can do it, we will do it, because we have a lot of possibilities in Flexbox and especially in grids. And sometimes we have to change order. It's really hard to not get a mismatch between DOM order and visual order, especially if you're working across multiple breakpoints in responsive web design. So at some point, we have to change it. All right, so what do we do? Well, first of all, we have to think about source order early on, even before we write any HTML and CSS, and we have to closely work together with designers so that we don't encounter problems or order problems while we are working. We should start with well-structured HTML, of course, and also, I know it's 2018, everything is component-based, we build components, but still, we should look at our components in a page context. So we should always check how they work together in a document. It's really important. It's also a good idea to write our CSS mobile first and change the layout according to screen sizes, and then test what we've built using a keyboard. And not just test on the desktop, but on different screen sizes. So on pretty much every breakpoint where we change layout. And if there is a mismatch, if there are some problems, we should return to the source code and change it there and not in CSS. The Dark Side of the Moon spent 736 weeks on the American Billboard charts. That's more than 14 years. And I still haven't listened to the album. I listened to 2 songs, but I will check it out on my way home. I promise. The next topic is semantics. Some experts, including Rachel Andrew, have very early feared that developers will start compromising on semantics in order to be able to use grid. Let me show you why. Let's say we have a form. In this form, I have 2 divs, and in each div there is an input field and a label, one for the name and one for the email. And then I have a field set with a legend, and the value of the legend is shirt size, and I have 2 radio buttons, one with the label S for small and one with the label M for medium. And this is what my form looks like. Now that's all right, but I would like to clean this up a bit. I want all labels to be in a left column and all input fields in another column, in the second column. No problem with grid. I select the form, I set display to grid. I use the grid template columns property to create 2 columns. I use the max content keyword for the first column, which will make the column only as wide as the largest child item. That's really cool. And then I set the second column to a maximum width of 600 pixels. And I use some gap, so some spacing between my grid items. This is what we get. Not quite what I wanted, because only direct child items of a grid container will be placed in the grid. So in our case, the 2 divs and the field set, but I want the inputs and the labels to be placed there in the legend and also the radio buttons. Okay, so what do? I'm doing this for 10 years now. I know how to fix this. I just get rid of the divs. Who needs divs anyway? I get rid of the field set, and I change the legend to a strong, and I put the radio buttons in a container, and bam, problem solved. It is a solution, but it's not a good solution. Not only did I just change the experience for screen reader users for the worse, but the form is now very hard to scan when displayed with CSS. And that kind of stuff happens all the time to me. Just go on vacation to Italy and try to use a public Wi-Fi. You will be happy to at least get HTML. CSS is not going to make it over the wire. When a form looks like this is very hard to use. Okay, so compromising on semantics isn't the solution. What is a solution? Subgrid maybe. Subgrid is really, really cool. We can use subgrids and apply it to a grid item, and then the grid item will pass its characteristics as a grid item to its direct child items, making them grid items as well, even though they're not direct child items of the grid container. Okay, so I select the divs, I select the field set, I set display to grids, I set the grid template columns property to subgrid, and that's it. Really, really cool. But support for subgrid is so bad it doesn't even have a can I use page. The problem is that it is only part of level 2 of the specification. There is a draft for level 2, they're working on it, it's public, you can check it out, you can contribute to it, but it's not there yet. And it will take some time. Okay, what else can we do? We could try using display contents. Who of you knows of display contents? Okay, display contents is also really, really cool. If you set display to contents on an item, its child items will act as if the element does not exist. So that's exactly what we want for our input and labels. So I select the divs, I select the field set, I set display to contents, and this is what we get. It's perfect. All our items are now they're not direct child items of the grid container, but still they're laid out in the grid. That's pretty awesome. I'm so sorry, but Edge doesn't support display contents. And that, of course, isn't the issue here, because we could just apply progressive enhancement and that's it, that's cool. But the reason why Edge doesn't support display contents is the main issue here. There is a bug with display contents. If you apply display contents to an element, some browsers will remove it from the accessibility tree, making it completely inaccessible to screen reader users, and that's a really bad bug. And Edge will only implement contents if all the other browsers fix this bug. Firefox did it in 62, I think right now we're at 64 or something like that, but the bug is still present in Chrome, Safari and Opera. So yeah, that's really bad. Just to give you an example what kind of difference it makes. Let's say I use a screen reader on this field set here and I try to read the text. This is what it sounds like.
S, selected radio button, 1 of 2, shirt size. M, selected radio button, 2 of 2, shirt size.
So you can hear that it said M, selected radio button, 2 of 2, shirt size. It reads the label, the legend with the option. That's pretty cool. Because especially if you have a lot of different options, it's nice to have this information with the option. Now, if I apply display contents to the field set.
S, selected radio button, 1 of 2. M, selected radio button, 2 of 2.
We get almost the same information, but now it doesn't read the legend anymore because it's not associated to the field set anymore. And this is a problem. It's a small problem, but still. And this doesn't just apply to grid items. We can, for example, select an unordered list, set display to contents, and then we have a reset. We don't have to set padding to 0, margin to 0, and list style type to none. We could just use display contents. But again, the problem here is this list will be removed from the accessibility tree. Pink Floyd helped to finance the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail by the comedy group Monty Python in 1975. Some other investors were Led Zeppelin and Genesis. The last topic for today is cross-browser support. If you remember, I told you that Microsoft shipped an implementation of Grid behind the MS vendor prefix in 2011, so 7 years ago. All the other browsers shipped theirs in 2017. And in between those 6 years, a lot of things have happened. A lot of things have changed, and the implementation of Grid we have today is very different to the one in IE 10, 11, and early versions of Edge. Pretty much the only thing we can do in the old specification or with the old specification is to draw grids and place items explicitly. There are no gaps, there are no areas, most shorthands don't work, there is no auto placement, alignment is very limited, so it's very, very limited. But if you want to use it, you can. You just select it like any other item and use the prefix properties. So in this case, display MS Grid and MS Grid columns and rows. And if we have a 2x2 grid with 4 items, this is what it looks like in Chrome. So all 4 items will be laid out in the grid. And this is how it looks like in IE 11 and 10. All items are stacked in the top left corner. The problem is there is no auto placement, so we have to select every single item and place it explicitly on their respective position. And then we have the same result. So if you have this very specific use case where you have a defined number of items and they have fixed positions, then it probably makes sense to use grid with the old specification. Oh, of course, also if you don't need gaps, because there are no gaps, there's no spacing in the old specification. What about Autoprefixer? Isn't there anything Autoprefixer can do? Those people know their stuff. They know how to make things happen. Well, it's kind of complicated. First of all, you have to enable autoprefixing for grid properties, which is a good thing because the maintainers decided to not enable it by default because the specifications are so different. But if you enable it and you run Autoprefixer, you will see that the display property, the grid template columns property, and rows will get prefixes, but not the grid gap property, because again, no gaps in the old specification. But Autoprefixer wouldn't be Autoprefixer if they didn't have a fix for that. What you have to do is to use the grid template shorthand, and then, and this is very nice, they will take the value from the grid gap property and add fake rows and columns with that width between real columns and rows. I mean, that's really cool, and I really appreciate the creativity, but it creates false assumptions. It might happen, or it's very likely that someone will try to clean up the code or change something, or just not understand why this is happening when they open up DevTools. Yeah, and this is not the only gotcha when it comes to using Autoprefixer on grid items. Area names must be unique across the whole document. There are no negative line numbers, unfortunately. The grid shorthand doesn't work. There are no named lines, at least at the moment. And it's not possible to define end lines only. And again, there is no auto placement. Now, after Harry's talk, I was sitting in the audience and I checked Twitter. And I had to change the slide because now they have limited auto placement. And when I say now, I mean yesterday. So I had to add a few slides. I saw this tweet by Shep this morning. He said, the Autoprefixer team has landed simple grid auto placement support in IE. And that was today at 8:39. Okay, so I went on GitHub. I checked the commits, yesterday's commits, and it says, does it work? Yeah. Implement auto placement. I was like, oh, fuck, now I have to change everything. But it's not that bad because it works, but only if you have an explicit grid, so you have to define all rows and all columns. It doesn't work with autofit and autofill, which makes grid really, really cool and flexible. And there are some more gotchas. I didn't even put all of them there. So it's really limited and basic. Now, another question you might have is, who cares about Internet Explorer? Why would we support Internet Explorer? At least in Austria, we have 11.6% IE users, and I'm pretty sure that this is the same in every European country, I would say. So a lot of people still using IE. And support for Internet Explorer is, or it seems like it is, a barrier for many developers. Benjamin asked on Twitter, if you haven't used CSS Grid yet, it's because, and 42% said Flexbox is fine. Well, if it's fine, it's cool. But 30% said IE support, and I think that's a bad thing because we have cool new stuff. We have grid, we have clip path, shapes, we have mixed blend mode, and so on. Many cool new things we always wanted, and we should use it. But we shouldn't force support on older browsers. So the key here is to apply progressive enhancement and give cool modern browsers cool stuff and provide fallbacks for older or less capable browsers. It's been 8 years that we have now responsive web design, and I'm pretty sure that our clients and our users understand that there is no "this is how the website looks like" state. It highly depends on the device, on the client or the user settings, on the operating system and the browser how the website looks like. So it's not necessary to force new stuff on them. Or at least that's my opinion. Okay, now I showed you a lot of things, a lot of bad things, annoying things, things that can harm accessibility. And now the last question for today is, should we use Grid or just leave it? Let me answer that with a quote by my favorite band, Pink Floyd. There is no dark side of the Grid really, matter of fact, it's all dark. It is. No, of course it isn't. Use Grid, use it today, but just use it responsibly. So if you use properties like grid template areas, don't use it on very interaction-sensitive components. Test with your keyboard and test on different sizes. If you use the keyboard just to test order, you will encounter a lot of things that might be bad for accessibility. So testing with the keyboard is always a good thing. Don't compromise on semantics. If you see yourself changing or flattening document structure or compromising on semantics just in order to be able to use Grid, don't use Grid. If you're using Autoprefixer, make sure that everybody on the team knows what's happening, why it's happening, comment everything, link to issues and to GitHub repos and so on. Make sure that your components work in older browsers and less capable browsers, and embrace the power of progressive enhancement. Don't force stuff on browsers that they don't support. Thank you.